Yeah, we're ready to start.
Okay.
This morning, we're going to take turn in the various sections of our presentation. And Brent will be doing the first two sections, and I'll take the lead for a third one. And we'll be taking turns like this, but we're going to cover much ground in that session. And perhaps if we go to the next slide, you'll see what are finally our goals for this session.
So I will kick this off for us here. So as you know, last week when we spoke, we had a wonderful opportunity to lay the table to better understand and update our thinking about Paul, particularly the recent Paul scholarship. Today we're going to be talking about a focus on Corinthians and what we call leading from the middle. And we have a few driving questions to take us forward. Most importantly, we want to start to think more about what is 1 Corinthians about. In other words, we're going to look at one of the particular letters, perhaps one of the most famous letters. And as we unpack that letter and its context and the players and people who are intersecting with it, we want you to think about who are these Corinthians who have become Christ's followers? Sort of, how do we better understand this community? So section 1, we're taking a look at the Corinthian correspondence. And we know that there are 2 long letters, and that those letters form, at this point, the corpus of the Corinthians correspondence, although we acknowledge that there was a previous lost letter, and we know that when we look at chapter 5, verse 9, that there was something that Paul wrote that we haven't seen. We also note that, and we said this last time, that we actually don't have the correspondence on the other side of this dialogue, which makes it interesting.
Just one quick question. What we haven't seen would be a third letter to the Corinthian or a passage of the first or the second?
It's the prior to the 1 Corinthians letter, and we sometimes call it 0 Corinthians. That's just as a marker, but we don't have it. So the point is that we know that it exists because he mentions it in chapter 5. And so again, moving forward, we have 2 extant letters. That's what we have. And I think, again, I want to make the point that we don't have the mirror, the other side. So we actually don't know what, for example, Chloe and or her associates may have written. We're looking again at Paul's reading and understanding of a previous letter. We also know that in 1 Corinthians, there are 16 chapters. So we call them chapters now. They weren't written as chapters. Jean-Francois did a wonderful, wonderful way of setting for us that these were really written speeches in a sense. They were dictated as letters, but they came forward and were performed by associates. So when we say things like chapters or themes as we go forward, you're going to remember that that's sort of been imposed upon how we now read today. But there are 16 chapters for 1 Corinthians, and there's 13 for 2 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is, in some sense, the most dialogic letter. What we mean by that is that we hear questions and positions being taken by the Corinthians, to which Paul often refers explicitly. And we get a good sense of the role of Chloe as what we might say, leader, thought leader, co-leader in the community, who comes to Paul with a set of concerns and questions and issues that are articulated inside of Paul's response. Essentially, it looks as if Chloe, who was an early associate of Paul's, perhaps they met, obviously they met when he first founded and came and got connected to the community and helped to start to organize it. We have a sense that they built a strong relationship because she feels confident enough to, in a sense, report to him that she's very, very concerned about what she's seeing in later developments. Now, these could be developments months or even a year or two in the early congregation. I don't want to say that Chloe is an informant in the sort of negative connotation of that, but I do want to say in the positive, almost ethnographic sense, she is a person who is to be trusted as a reliable witness to what is occurring. And We don't have her letter. We don't have the letter that prompted this, right? But we get a sense of urgency because Paul not only addresses her concerns, but addresses them quite systematically from what we can tell. So this is, again, what's so fascinating. We've got this sort of internal dialogue going on between two of the associates and leaders, but we don't yet know exactly where this is going to play in terms of the larger community. Sosthenes is mentioned as an associate. We're going to start using the word associate, and we'll unpack how we differentiate associate from co-worker, which is sometimes a more common way to talk about it. There probably were different roles, but Sosthenes is going to come to deliver this letter, which is another way of thinking about, again, who's speaking. So Paul's not here. He's not going to be in front of the community reading his letter. He's having Sosthenes do that for him. And it is addressed to the entire church of Corinth. Now, again, we have to decenter our notions of churches. These are not the Sistine Chapel. These are not standard Protestant churches. These are not the things we see all around us today. When we say church, we really mean a collection, association, and a gathering. Paul gives us a sense that there is information that's being passed along from Chloe's people, could be her and several others in the group. Now, when we even say that, I just want to step back for a moment and remind ourselves, this is not a congregation of 1,000 people. This is not a congregation of a large systematic church or synagogue system. This is literally a small grouping. We'll talk more about that. But when we say Chloe's people, these may be Chloe's allies, Chloe's close associates and friends. And what we hear embedded in this First Corinthians letter is that there's a deep concern for faction. Now, faction is going to play a direct role in our next talk, because if we think about organization, particularly when you have a nascent organization that's not yet well regulated with lots of policy and mechanisms for controlling conflict, faction is a really important point. We then pivot in the letter by the 5th chapter to something very specific. And that's an interesting point too. It's imbued in an ethical set of problems. There's some ethical language that we might say is a standard formula of how to talk about doing the right thing. But there's a case of incest that apparently has to do with the marriage of one person to another person's family member, and that's seen as inappropriate. That has, again, triggered Chloe and her associates. Taking each other to court and other ethical breaches, this goes into that larger question of, if we've formed a community and we've built associations and we are moving in a similar direction, why are we going to Roman court to solve problems? So again, a very fascinating early problem in the church. And we saw this play out later, centuries later, as actually parallel forms of adjudication are set up. There's a wonderful book on this question of bishops in Augustine's time and kind of that whole way of handling conflict in later centuries. But early on in Paul, we see it. There's problems at the dinner table. Now we're back to these really almost mundane problems, things that seem almost absurd at some level, like why would anyone care? But apparently they do care, and Chloe's people are really wanting Paul to give guidance and leadership on these questions of how we should sit together.
Brent, what do the numbers in parentheses mean?
That means the chapters. So if you want to follow and track our thematic points, you can go straight and find the actual chapter citations, okay?
So for instance, if I look at factions 1, it means what?
Chapter 1, verse 10. Chapter 4, verse 20, and that would be through, right? If you look at the case of incest, you'd find that in chapter 5. If you look at the case of ethical breaches and taking each other to court, chapter 6 in the letter. And if you're looking at problems at the dinner table, that's actually a very small verse, right? You can see that doesn't take up a lot of space. That also gives you a sense of, again, how much Paul is expounding on this problem. So some things he's expounding very quickly, and other things he's allowing himself more time to orate and talk about. And again, we're using the chapter structure today, but it gives you a sense of amount of space and time for what he's talking about. Now, Paul's reactions to the Corinthians letter continue on with a set of concerns. And we'll talk about in a minute how we've identified these things. We haven't originated them. These actually come out of the work of John Hurd. But it's important to remember he's touching on a lot of things here. So this letter is expansive. It deals with things that seem fairly mundane or just about manners. And then there's things that are potentially quite ethically important and challenging to the community. Marriage and celibacy is something that was on the minds of the community, and particularly Chloe's group. And they're looking for
Well,
clarification.
Just on this, we have to distinguish in First Corinthians that on the one hand, there's an oral report made by Chloe's people to Paul. And there's also a letter that the Corinthians, other people probably in that group, sent to Paul. And at the beginning of chapter 7, it becomes very clear that Paul is now addressing the letter from the Corinthians, because you have the introductory line, now about what you wrote me. And what, he cites, a one line or two lines of their letter. And after citing it, he starts to answer.
Thank you for that clarification.
And all these, the first issues which we listed are those that originate from Chloe's oral report. And if you go to the next slide, these are points that were mentioned in the letter sent by the Corinthians to Paul. And he's really answering their points systematically, methodically, one after the other through these chapters.
So one thing we can draw then is that the source of his response comes from a letter that we can't see. It also comes from, you're saying, oral communication that we infer, but again, it's mixed sources, and that's what's interesting too. So he's responding to a variety of concerns, right, Jean-François?
Yes.
From different sources. But we don't have any of those actual letters.
Slide before, can you go back to the slide before? Have there been a wise scholar who saw why were some mentioned only orally and other in writing? Is there some insight on this, or it just happens that it's just a sentence and that nobody has come up as to why certain things were mentioned only orally and others in writing?
Well, John Hurd would be the person to answer that, I suspect, which is what we're going to point you to in a minute. But Jean-François, do we want to take on the question of whether Hurd addressed that or others?
Well, there's no specific reason why, some things would come to through Chloe's people, and some others by the letters. One thing we're going to see later on is that the Church of Corinth, what we call the Church of Corinth, is more or less a federation of house churches. And, to have factions, you need parties, various parties. And that's, the various parties, the various factions have a different outlook on things, and sometimes they collide. But, one group may have been sending a letter to Paul, and another group may have taken the opportunity to communicate to him verbally what's going on. And Paul is addressing finally both sources of information that may at some point collide, may have very different perspective on things. I hope that's helpful.
I think it's helpful, but I also think, again, we have to be careful with how much we know and how much we don't know. So we can't say that there are like 7 houses, and these 7 houses have a set of members, and house 1 is sending something and house 3 is sending another thing. That's too much. We can't infer that. But what we could say is that it's not a monolithic one house show, and that it's likely that there are a variety of different gathering groups in Corinth. It's a relatively large city, we know. So if that's true, then sure, people could have written Paul from different parts. Jean-François, one of the things I've been trying to figure out, and again, this is where you guided me a bit on this, is what if much of this information in terms of the active stance of getting Paul's leadership advice back into the community is not so much about this church over here and that church over there, but rather an actual conflict within a major sort of significant house. And I think that's more problematic than the idea that it's being parceled out by different people's complaints. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say that it's and here, I don't want to jump the gun and go over next sections. Is there would be conflicts in associations at that time, and that would happen all the time. And there would be policy making about dealing with conflicts, but sometimes conflicts originate basically from people from various houses coming together. They are not, they don't have the same social status, and they're claiming something related to their social status, and they feel that they're not getting it. So that's, and when you see also the diversity of positions, sometimes the positions are completely opposed to each other. You have
Right.
to ask yourself, well, would these people live daily together and holding these completely opposite positions? So the safe, knowing something about associations at that time and conflicts and how they originate, and knowing also that the diversity of positions, usually people go with the most common assumption that there are several small groups that oppose each other.
So I'd like to move us also from this kind of very structural level into the content or the thematic pieces, although we're not going to spend much time. I just want to make a quick note. The question of idle meat is very important, right? So when we talk about this idea that there's conflict, it's not just internal to the status of each person and their own beliefs about what is right. It's also related to this idea of social intercourse and interaction in Corinth with existing cultural and spiritual, or we could just say ritual practices. So this idea of interacting with idols, meaning pagan temples, is a problem. And it's identified significantly in Paul as a problem that he needs to comment on. The idea of women in assemblies, if we're thinking about those concerns, the last time we talked about how many of Paul's views about women have been misascribed to letters that actually it's unclear whether he wrote them. In this letter, we know that Paul wrote this letter. We're quite, that is dictated it. We're quite convinced of that. And so his position on women assemblies would be important for people who want to understand the way in which gender may have played a role in forming these communities and any potential conflict. And I think the most interesting part, which we'll talk about going forward in the following week, this idea of spiritual gifts, or what I call a spiritual division of labor, that there actually are different orientations in these early church houses about how best to show not only one's faith, one's belief system, one's engagement with ritual practice, but also kind of a pecking order. So I think, again, the content is fascinating. There's a lot to mine here for thinking about leadership. Women, men, different sorts of dispositions and proficiencies and skills, frankly, that people have in a community and how they want to express those. So last but not least, these three are critical. Paul talks directly about resurrection here. In other words, there's a concern by some about the meaning of resurrection. What does it mean? When is it coming? How can we expect it? And Paul does talk later in other letters, but this comes up for the Corinthians. We have to acknowledge that. Also, this critical issue, which goes back to leadership. How do you lead a group of people to ask for money from them to go ahead and give money to a place they've never been, that they may not even necessarily know why we're giving money? And so again, it's just an interesting point for Paul's leadership. He's got to articulate why and how we're going to give money on behalf of the Church of Jerusalem, which of course would be Peter and James. And then Apollos is fascinating, because who is Apollos? He turns out to be a figure purportedly from Alexandria, Jewish, who has voice in this community. Some houses are elevating Apollos as an alternative to Paul, or at least a complement to Paul. We know that Cephas, Peter, was also visiting the Corinthians at one point as well. So when we talk about distributed leadership, leadership at a distance, how do you deal with when you're a leader of something, when someone says to you, yeah, but this leader said this? And so again, it's a complex place. That's why we're choosing this letter to focus on. If you want to know more, take a look at Hurd's work. Jean-Francois, do you want to say anything about this book just quickly? Because apparently you have a contact with it.
Yes. This book came out in 1965. It's really old, therefore, in the field, but it's really looking at how First Corinthians was put together. That is, elements from Chloe's reports, elements from the letters and its sorts, what comes from where. Plus, it has a very lengthy introduction about how do we establish the life of Paul's. The book has, it's 1965. Most books published in 1965 are never mentioned again because they are completely outdated. But this is one of the studies that has entered. And by the way, John Hurd was from the US, but he did his whole career at the University of Toronto, taught at Trinity College. And taking 2 courses also with him, he would base much of his teaching on First Corinthians still on his book. So that has remained the place to go to know how First Corinthians was put together.
Well, again, if we ask ourselves why First Corinthians for a discussion of leadership, which is a part of our series, first of all, every good leader must bring counsel and calm and a degree of clarity when there's dissension, debate, or uncertainty inside of any group. It matters that people figure out how to manage conflict as they build organizations. Second of all, we know that this letter is about setting priorities again and figuring out when you're debating things to go above the debate and ask yourself what's really at stake, what is the actual essence of this problem. And Paul does a lot of recentering, we call it, which is an interesting move as a leader to make that move. And the recentering piece also connects to a fundamental, interesting question for an early organization, which is, are we in this together or are we going to break ourselves apart and end this organization? We've seen many political and civic associations come and go in this world. And many times there's stories, biographies spun about the breakdown of a particular grouping of people and how that occurred. Paul gives us insight early into the question of how do you tell people that you care about, but you also recognize may be misguided, that this is not a competition and we're not trying to outbid each other in terms of who knows more or who's more in the know regarding where the direction of this community should go. So I think Paul really, again, exercises leadership, and we'll talk more about them when we look at the leadership literature next week, where these intersections occur. So if we go to the question of the city, we did want to actually think just again about where are we? You know, we're constantly contextualizing this work. That's one of the themes of our presentations. We're interested in knowing where this city is. And one thing that when I sort of did some more research on this and just started to think about what is the story of this Roman colony that was once a flourishing Greek city, we need to remember this place was destroyed by the Romans in a war. There was a sort of scourged attempt to take down the status of this city early on. Julius Caesar sort of puts a feather in his cap and calls this his crown jewel by 46 BCE. And of course, this would be approximately 100 plus years before Paul's entrance into the city, but it becomes a city of importance. It's a Roman, obviously, capital, a province of Chia. But one of the things that I find most interesting is that many of the pieces of the city that we remember tell us that this was a city of importance to the Greeks, and the Greeks would have been aware of this city as one of its own flourishing city-states, but it was never really an intellectual center. It was never really a city, of course, compared to Athens, that's easy to say, that people would have drawn a lot of wisdom from. Apparently, there was 7 sages of this era, people that were identified as great thinkers in the communities. And there's only one that comes from this city, and he's fairly marginal. It's not Plato, it's not Aristotle, it's not a lot of the other even playwrights that we know. So while it's a very important city in Greek civilization, and Corinthians would have had pride in their city, it's not necessarily because of the arts or of philosophy or any of the piece of high culture today that we often look at when we look back on the Greeks. What is important about Corinth is that it was a major trading center, as we said last time, and that the best way to visualize that is to actually look at these two ports. And I'm going to just take a note here. So here is the isthmus or the peninsula. If you're coming from the east and you're trading and bringing your ships in, you're going to drop them right here at Sancrea, and you're going to have to take a land route on logs and move your ships across. There's no Panama Canal at this point. The canal that's drawn out here was built much later in the last 200 years. It was not built in this time. So they move these products and through their shipping all the way to here. And then again, the city that gets a lot of attention is Lycaum. And this one is actually pushing those goods up to Italy, Sicily, and Rome. So the better way maybe to visualize it is just to think about how trade is coming from the east, from Egypt. It's coming from what we now obviously would call Judea or Israel, Syria. It's making its way along through the Dodecanese and eventually comes right into here. It's a bottleneck, lots of activity. And then these two port cities are the gateway then to move people out and beyond. So this gives us a sense of the strategic location, the commerce location, the trading location. Again, not a place of necessarily culture with a capital C.
Brent,
Yes.
that might be a too specialized a question, but if you, in case you know, how large is the distance on ground, and what is the saving in terms of time of taking the ship on ground rather than turning around Greece? So I understand the importance of the place.
Yeah, this is a question that I was actually thinking about myself, because the way I visualized it was it's not that much harder to come around here and go that direction, right? And you would think that this is not like going down to the Cape Horn or really having to go all the way around a continent, right?
Yeah.
But in the ancient Greek mind, it might have been different. Go ahead, Jean-Francois.
Yeah, in terms of distance, it's about 10 kilometers.
And time to take a ship on ground for 10 kilometers rather than circling around the south of Greece and going back.
They actually conceived that it was shorter.
Oh yes, for sure.
To do this, and they did it. And I'm always impressed by what I would call ancient technology, because you have to really pull the ships across 10 kilometers on logs, and they moved. We've seen this. You put a series of logs, and you roll the ship on it, and you keep moving the logs. Nero, a little later than Paul, at the end of Paul's life, started digging actually the canal. And it's said by Pliny the Younger that he brought 6,000 Jewish slaves to dig the canal. Yes. And there was some progress, and Nero died and the work stopped.
And I think that's a fascinating point.
Yeah, we had to wait until the half of the 19th century to have the work of digging the canal completed.
And we had asked the question earlier, were there Jews in Corinth that could have had affiliation either through business and trade? Maybe they didn't necessarily practice with Paul or agree with his viewpoints on anything, but the point is, were there Jews there? So when you say there were 6,000 slaves, right, we have this report. The question is, did they stay in Corinth, or did they endly disperse and go back to the quote unquote homeland? So I think this is a fascinating question. We talked about all the different ethnos, all the different fairyland, Carrefour, we said last time, right? The Hungarians have a very interesting phrase for their own country. They literally call themselves a fairy country, because they see themselves as a place where West and East have met. And obviously the Turks were in Hungary. And I bring this up as, when we think of certain sorts of locations in the globe, these are places where people are coming and going. Today, it might be in Istanbul with the Bosphorus. this was a place where people converged and they located themselves here. Again, why did they not just be practical and go down underneath? Well, maybe this goes back to they needed to do commerce and trade and work in this area, and they need a resting point. They need a place to be able to gather themselves, store goods, whatever. We don't necessarily know. Maybe an archaeologist would have a better sense. But I think for our purposes, it's important to think that this is a critical place where everyone is going through and around. And by the way, just anecdotally, it turns out that as many port cities are, I'm thinking here, I don't want to name any European cities to embarrass anybody, but there are some cities in which it's known that the nightlife is quite active. If you see when I say nightlife, right? This would be a place of drinking, a place of prostitution, a place of arts and play that were related to the kinds of people that came and went. So again, we shouldn't see this as a kind of city that is above the fray. This is a city that probably has a lot of things happening in it. And this also may be why we get the concerns that we see later, for example, about sexual ethics. It's not just a standard Christian statement about, porneia, but it may actually have been that this city was so active and lively in that area that it just concerned some of the early church members. So again, interesting city. We can say that it's smaller than Ephesus, which we know is really the crown jewel of Rome at this period. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to be at Ephesus. It's an impressive location and place, but this Corinth is not quite that. Corinth, again, more of a trading center. Ephesus, as Jean-Francois said last time, more of an administrative center. And I would even argue, having seen the Celsius Library there, that it probably was also considered a repository, not just for books, but for learning as well. So it's a different place. It's lesser known than Athens in classical antiquity, obviously, again, because if you're interested in the humanities, you're not going to pull a lot of literature and tragedy and writing from Corinth. But it was a very favored and secure city with well-established trade routes and ports and places to exchange goods and services. Another interesting question might be around piracy, right? We don't know enough. As Jean-Francois had said, the Romans did an excellent job at this point of controlling and managing the seas. So I doubt that was a concern, but it was a secured city and people knew that they had probably a better chance of not having to worry about any unsavory characters in the Mediterranean if they were working through this location. Corinth is a boom town, but it's not a boom town like we might say in the Wild West. It's not built from nothing, or it's not taking over an indigenous people's land. The indigenous people of Corinth are the Greeks. So they are the ones who are there. And we talked about this, but we want to emphasize, again, the economy includes various trades and professions. We'll talk about that. And therefore, there are different social classes. It's a highly stratified society. But those class positions are also a bit in flux just by the nature of the movements of population, as we talked about. So section 3, a little bit more about the Corinthians before we get to the real interesting meat and potatoes.
Yes, so I'm going to take the lead on that one. And let me tell you up front that we're going to use much of many of the insights from a book that was published in 1983 by Wade Meeks from Yale University. It's the title, as you can see, First Urban Christians, but also the subtitle, The Social World of the Apostle Paul. What the book does is to use insights from sociology to describe the social location of the early Christians in the Greco-Roman world. And in fact, once you start reading the book, you realize that the book mostly focuses on the first letter to the Corinthians, First and Second Corinthians, actually, and also about the city of Corinth. Why for? It's just because Corinth, among all these cities to which Paul would write, is probably better known because of the abundance of texts and also because of the archaeological research that was done in ancient Corinth. And there's also a ton of inscriptions that have been retrieved in Corinth. So you know more or less how the the empire would do sometimes propaganda through inscriptions, and there would be inscriptions of all sorts of associations that were retrieved in Corinth. So what is Meek's outlook on these Corinthians? How does he describe these first urban Christians? He describes them mostly as people who would fall into the cracks of the established social classes. People who were in an agrarian societies, they would not be necessarily connected to the land as landowners or farm workers. They would not, in an agrarian society, they wouldn't fit neatly in any of these places. They would also be considered as, nowadays we could call them social climbers. People in a society where people tend to try to stay where they are in terms of social class. These people would try to move to an upper class. And this is also the category that was a new categories that appeared at that time, people doing commerce and people doing crafts, making objects and moving objects. Again, because of the Roman Empire, the Romans have built this road system, mostly to move troops, soldiers from one place to another, but the roads also proved to be the gateway, the means to move goods from one place to another on land. Again, the Romans have taken mostly care of the problem of piracy on the Mediterranean, so it allowed also for commerce to boom. We can never think about what, contemporary industrial mass production of objects, but we can see that there was a commerce was expanding at that time. Many people got involved into commerce. And it's believed that these early Christians would have been mostly involved in making the production of objects and also moving these objects from one place to another. When I think also about commerce, which is booming, traveling is booming, and people relocate for mostly economic reasons from one place to another. So let's.
François, just before, I wanted to let you finish that slide, but I have a question on what social climbing is. Okay, there were the Romans are famous for having coined the word cursus honorum to talk about the career that the young patricians could, the sort of ladder to glory that young patrician could climb, and there were different sort of people who would have different success in acquiring glory. But they were of the same social class, and they were climbing together on the same cursus honorum that was closed out to other people within society. You're using social climber to mean what? Because we have such a strong view of what social climbing is today. Are they nouveau riche? Are these categories correct, or and what are they climbing to? In a society where being member of the equestrian class or patrician class is not exactly open.
They'll never become members of equestrian classes, but it's really something about nouveau riche. They are climbing socially through acquiring wealth. And you see this sometimes when you read some authors. I've been let's say reading Balzac recently, the novels, and you see all this category of bourgeois from the Restoration and after the First Empire, who don't belong to the nobility, but are starting to move into these circles. So what happens is that these people who get involved in trade, they don't fit the established social classes, but nevertheless, they're gaining, they're creating new spaces for themselves to move around, but because of their wealth.
And how
They're
wealthy
getting
can,
wealth,
and
but
how,
it's not, you don't have these people who's who make the cover of nowadays Forbes magazine, who started from nothing and ended up at the with the financial empire, and who are celebrated. These are people who are still struggling, but they're moving up slowly and with a lot of toil, but they're making their way in the social scale.
so you're talking more of something akin to what we would say were the French Canadians in Quebec City in the 19th century compared to the English aristocracy within Quebec City, and not the Donald Trump. They were not so rich. They were getting above the general population, but they were not. They didn't have estates. They didn't have. That's what you're trying to say.
Yeah, or I would say, because I've been in California for next to almost 20 years, I'm thinking about these Filipinos and people from Korea who arrive here as immigrants, and they buy a convenience store and they work hard, and they suddenly buy some real estate. And they start having much real estate, and they sell and they buy, and they're still struggling to make ends, but they're moving, they're getting in a better position. That's what I
Yeah.
would that's how I would envision these people
Okay.
who have come to Corinth, who don't belong to the actual social classes.
And we're going to discuss that in a minute, right? We're going to talk a little bit about Frieson's model, and he sort of lays out the social categories, which I think will go even more to the sort of structural question.
True.
Obviously, the question of whether people are moving up into a qualitatively different social class, for example, one that's for the Roman elites, the answer is no. Are these people moving down to the bottom layer of society below subsistence, meaning are they beggars? Are they struggling to even find day labor? No. So we're talking about this sort of strata in the middle, and how do we even conceptualize what it means to move in that middle space? But I also think we're going to get to that in a minute. So I have a hand up, Cloud.
Yeah,
Please go ahead.
I have a question about social classes. Is the being part of the new this new church is a way to climb into the social community?
Yeah, I would think that the church also allows to do networking,
Yeah.
to find new partners.
Okay.
And people who are like-minded, that is, who don't belong to the establishment, the established categories, and
Yeah.
therefore may be more open in welcoming people like them, who
Okay.
don't already belong to social categories. Let me, if we want to focus on an example from text, we've been talking about Chloe. Chloe, again, is mentioned only once in Paul's letters, but see how much we can tease out from this only mention. So this is a female name. And we hear that she has people, Chloe's people, which is usually a euphemism for employees. So the people who come to meet Paul are Chloe's employee. Now, these people travel. Why would you travel at that time? Mostly for business. So, which rings the question, which calls a question, could Chloe be a businesswoman? That's very likely. She's also considered to be a reliable informant. She has some gravitas, some importance in that group, because whatever she says is going to be taken seriously. In that sense, the mention of Chloe here breaks some stereotypes that this is a patriarchal society, and here you have a woman who's likely a businesswoman, who's doing, I won't call it international commerce, but who can send her people around to travel for business. And that would be a good example of the kind of people who don't match exactly your social expectations.
Exactly.
Because she's a woman, she may be doing business, and this is also a new kind of occupation.
And doesn't she end up carrying or purportedly carrying one of the letters to the Romans for Romans?
No, it would be Phoebe.
Phoebe. So we have another woman who breaks potentially a stereotype of somebody who's not capable of engaging in co-leadership or supporting and being not just simply a courier, but possibly a trusted, reliable.
Yes.
And we don't know what her occupation is. Okay.
And who travels.
Who travels and who's able to travel with her people. Again, this idea of these networks too. Let's remember, everybody who comes to a new city is looking for people that they can trust, particularly if they're engaged in some kind of more proactive stance, if they don't have money to sit on, but they need to actually engage with people. And I always think of this as this focus on urban Christians or people who are becoming Christ followers might have related to the very simple fact that you're also not just a misfit, but you're actually looking for trustworthy people. We talk about contracts, implicit and explicit contracts. Everyone has access to the Roman courts, or we would think, although that's the other question, whether as a citizen or non-citizen you would have any access in the latter category. But I think we can sense that people are looking for ways to find trustworthy networks, and there are ways to work together to achieve objectives beyond your own particular business or trade. So we hope that that's a piece of this picture. I just want to say a little bit about the milieu now before we clear some more of the table. So, and by the way, my pronunciation unfortunately is anglicized. So remind me, it's not milieu, but it is
milieu.
Milieu. Okay, I gotta put that. All right, milieu. And so we're looking here at a very interesting point. There's been a lot of research done, and I think it's important for us to remember we're doing a bit of teasing and weaving that together. But if you would like to look at the actual resources in the last 100 years, people have been attempting to put together how do we describe these Paulinian associates, these Christ-following Greeks and other ethnos that would be combined into the group. We have a lot here. And you can even see the categories, like last time we mentioned the word bourgeois and socially pretentious, disprivileged, poor and destitute. It's interesting that Deisman mentions the notion of poor and destitute. I think that's an overstatement, and we'll see in a minute. Again, to imagine that somehow Paul's associates, co-workers, and early Congregationalists were poor in the sense of being subsistence or below subsistence without trade and skills, it does not seem accurate. But by the time we come up into 93, and I think apply probably more realistic social categories, we start talking about an urban bourgeoisie, an entrepreneurial spirit. And of course, I think that would be interesting for the purposes of our talk for this community. Could we call these people entrepreneurs? Well, I mean, this isn't Steve Jobs. This isn't necessarily your local startup company. I think the way Jean-Francois just mentioned, it's more like a person who comes to a community and starts a small business, for example, a store or a trade tent making, someone who comes into town and says, let me see if I can start to build out a network of trade in tent making. Or one could even think of glassware and glassworks. These are smaller enterprises. But this term, entrepreneurial spirit, has been used. So this is some of the literature that points us in a direction. But before we go there, let's remember when we say accumulate wealth, or people who have some more wealth than simply selling their daily wages based on their labor, we get the image in the right-hand corner that we're dealing with sort of this bourgeoisie. They have accumulated a nice house in the hills and they're doing quite well. That would not be accurate. So it's important that we dispel that. Archaeological remains can give a false impression that early Christians lived in big houses. In fact, it's unlikely they did. We were thinking more that if you imagine a set of houses that are continuously joined, or even businesses that are joined in a city like Corinth, these may be just simply small little front door with a back end house, maybe an upper quadrant place where people could gather if you had the means to own the front store and the top part. But the point is, you're not dealing with anything like a Roman villa at this time. Jean-François, do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, and because if you go to the previous slide, on the left, you have the book cover of, a fairly widespread book in the study of early Christianity. It's St. Paul's Corinth, put together by Gerald Murphy O'Connor in the 1980s. And after this, Gerald Murphy O'Connor would say, well, the archaeological remains show us all these big houses, and that's probably what Corinth was about in the first century. But one thing I came to realize, especially when I was I was working on an archaeological excavation in Lower Galilee in the mid-90s, is that all the remains that you find in archaeological excavations are finally the remains of the rich people who could afford durable material. Typically, the poor leave no trace because they cannot afford to build with stone and to also have these kinds of constructions. So what we're finding in archaeological digs is finally we know how the rich and famous lived. We know very little about how poor people lived. And we shouldn't make assumptions that everyone could afford these houses. We know from text that this was not the case.
So we can assume, going back to our congregation, that most likely, given that several of these people, including Chloe, would have had enough means to have a storefront or some kind of a small business, then obviously has a little more space, a little more room, even if we don't have the remains. But it's a critical point here that these aren't villas with large, gardens where people can be entertained in mass. We're talking about fairly small quarters. And so when we think about the gathering, since we're not talking about churches, these could have been gathering areas in the back of the house or the back of the actual business, a room above. There's some thought that maybe they gathered when they had enough wealth to have a room above the business, that the 20 people maximum. These are not, again, large congregating spaces. And so we just have to think about kind of the, when we apply words like bourgeoisie, it's not like the accumulated wealth of the bourgeoisie in the 19th and 20th century. That's not the case. It's probably more like petite bourgeoisie, and it's probably much more like just around trade and small business owners. So if we're gonna label the first urban Christians, let's remember that we can draw from Frieson's model. In 2004, he did a very interesting attempt to sort of build a consensus about all of these poverty Pauline studies going all the way back to Deisman. So if we just take a look at that, we notice a few things. Well, first of all, there is a bit of a range and span in this period of time for Corinthians. The elites would have accumulated wealth through their political titles and networks. That goes back to the equestrian class. We think about all of the different ways in which the hierarchies of Roman society were only available for those who were a part of it. And if you're a newcomer to Corinth, it's almost obvious you're not going to be a part of that network. Moderately secure folks also existed in Corinth, meaning that they had enough accumulated wealth to be more than selling their day labor. And they would have some kind of a trade or profession. Paul's a great example of this. There's also a group of people who are stable or near subsistence. I'll unpack that in a minute. And then the subsistence or below that level, which I think is also really important for understanding Paul and his people. So the imperial elites are easy to identify. There's a lot of extant literature. Yes, the rich do tend to write history in the sense that a lot of their work and their buildings and their documents get left behind, and historians are quick to pick up on what they experienced. So we know that in Corinth, there would have been some imperial elites. There would have been some regional and provincial elites. Obviously in Corinth, probably more likely there's more of these equestrian families, provincial officials. And again, we're drawing off of this model that's been developed by Friesen. So that's our source for this.
Guys, before we move, it could be that what you're saying is okay on Paul, but I want to check something that has always puzzled me. The if you look at the New Testament literature, we are presented with characters who are of the who were educated with Herod, especially the one of the guy who's at the when Paul is looking for guidance, he's welcome into a community, and one of the guys is presented as having been schooled with Herod when he was a kid. Then you are presented in the gospel with centurions, so much. Uh, the army official who are there. We know that the archaeological evidence shows that that Christianity spread through the army, the rank of the army. We know that there were officials at the Roman court who were Christian, and very quickly, if you move, so it must have started somewhere. If you move you keep hearing about court officials who are forced to change religion or are fearing to conspire because they're Christians. So and now with the dig at Sepphoris, for instance, we realize that Nazareth might not have been the back hole that we were presented it was, but the suburb of a major city of the time, and that the idea that Jesus spoke only Aramean and not Greek might be moved. So it could be that all that you say is true about Paul, but there seems to me something that is emerging that that is a different sort of Christianity and early Christianity that we think about. So I just want you to say a few words about what you think of these ideas and how they square with what I think is the evidence we have about Paul. I don't contest that this is the evidence we have about Paul's Christianity. I'm just trying to square it into different other segments of early Christianity.
So I think there's two ways to handle the question. I'm going to defer to my colleague in a moment, but the first way is I think you're making the point, Jean-Francois, that we actually had said this before. There's not one Christian movement. There's not one group of Christ followers. Actually, you can intersect that in terms of region. You can intersect it in terms of history, in terms of the rollout from 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 AD. You could also intersect it in terms of regions. You mentioned the Gospels. Well, I don't think the Gospels, if we're talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, actually are talking about Corinth. So that's Paul, and Acts we know has some intersection with it. So I think your point is there's a complicated picture here. I'll defer to my colleague in terms of sort of answering another angle, but the way I look at that is we're not trying to describe early Christianity. We're simply trying to get a handle on the milieu of social classes in a way that Paul would have likely interacted not with municipal elites, but would have been dealing with other groups. So go ahead, Jean-Francois Racine, if you want to say more.
Yeah, well, I think you address it well. We also have to take into account that, let's say, between Paul's letters and the Gospels, there may be a 30, 40 years gap. And there's also a geographical gap where you may be appealing to other types of people. But let me just confirm what you've said, Jean-Francois. When you read the Gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, there's, they talk much about the poor. What you find out is that the poor is always other. It's not us, it's the others. It tells you something about where do these people see themselves in the society. So that's and you mentioned Sepphoris. Indeed, when I said that I was working on an excavation in Lower Galilee, I was working at Sepphoris, and Sepphoris is very interesting. Just between you and me, just to give you a crash course, Sepphoris is the new capital city of Lower Galilee. At some point, the kinglet of Galilee, Herod Antipas, decided to move the capital city from one place to a new site, and he had the whole city built. And what you find in Sepphoris, indeed, there are these very rich villas that are on the top, the upper part of Sepphoris. And we started digging in the lower parts, and to our great surprise, we also found these very big buildings. And Sepphoris was close to Nazareth at that time. that was the big construction site at Jesus' time. So it's difficult to imagine that people from Nazareth were never hired to work on that construction site. And
But
when
more
you
than
hear
that, François, suddenly the dig at Cyprus, to me, makes plausible the account of Mary's origin in the Proto-Evangelium of James in a way that I didn't think plausible until I heard about the digs at Cyprus. They present the James present Mary as a fairly wealthy, the daughter of a pretty wealthy Jewish priest. And I thought this was just embellishment from later story, and then suddenly you dig Separatist, and you suddenly there are people who would argue that if it was known that even if they were not so well to do, they would still be among the heirs of David, and it might have been known that they were the heirs of David, and there was some sort of poor nobility that had more status than they had wealth. There's this whole question. Anyway, this is far away from Paul, but but it's also because they don't fit in with everything I learned about early Christian. I don't know how to fit these people, and that's the reason why I raised it.
yes,
But I think it's good. I also just am managing time here. Cloud has his hand up. Cloud, why don't you share, and then we'll continue along.
Just I want to know, what do you mean by retainers? Who are these people?
I always get the feeling that, and again, clarify for me if I'm wrong, when I read about retainers, I tend to think of them as the people who are affiliated with those who are wealthy and have some kind of position where they can offer something. So, Jean-Francois, would you read it that way too?
yes, and I find the
Tapestries,
term,
people who make things for the rich.
Yeah, it's one of these terms that doesn't mean what it looks like it means. They are not trying to retain anything from other people, but they are able to get some wealth.
Hangers on, we say in English too.
Yes.
La suite, des gens qui sont people that are around the wealthy.
Around,
Yes.
exactly. They might be
Yes.
providing, music, or they might provide entertainment. They might even just providing some sort of marginal service, but they have access to the wealthy.
Okay, good.
Yes.
And so again, here's where we come to the real story. So we can wash away, at least in Paul's case in Corinth, pretty quickly that we're not dealing with the Christian movement with elites. We're looking more at what Priceman calls this idea of moderate surplus. These are merchants, traders, freed persons, obviously, some artisans, but especially those who employ others. That's the point, right? That they have the means to employ others in small projects, and military veterans as well. And of course, that goes back to this question of, we see a lot in the early Christian documents and the Gospels, sort of intersections with, as it was mentioned, parts of the Roman army, centurions, I'm sure. But there's also veterans. There's people who've finished their service and have gotten a piece of land or gotten access to something, and so they would also possibly be intersecting. Although when I think of military veterans, again, I don't imagine that there was a lot of these people in the community. There may have been, but the point is, it's different than this, right? Which is the stable near subsistence. So here again, and these categories are quite loose. And as I read through them in this research, I thought this is very overlapping, hard to make a lot of sense. But here again, we see large shop owners and some farm families. That's another point, that these are not rural communities. And if this is a farm family, they may be delivering vegetables and foodstuffs into the community and have some small plot. These are not patrician farmers. They're not people who employ others to farm. They don't have slaves necessarily. If they do, they don't have a lot of them. These are more just sort of small providers, much like our organic markets today. So I think when we think about this, this is the space of who our early Pauline communities are. And again, these categories are laid out in 7. I'm just the overlap is amazing to me in this research. But here's a point that I want to pull out, laborers. So there would have been laborers, people who had some skills, who sold their labor. There probably would have been those who were in between employment. Clearly, we think there was small shop tavern owners as well. in this subsistence level in Corinth. Again, how do we draw out inferences? Not easily, but we know that there are these social classes. Now, this is the one that's the real point, because when you go to the Lucian story of early Christianity and other parts of the Mediterranean, or actually closer to Judea and Samaria, there we hear a lot in the Gospels about orphans and beggars and those who are even lepers and leper colonies. And we hear about people who are very marginal. It appears that probably the gospel of Yeshua or Christ is actually targeted, according to some of the reports, on really looking at the marginal inside of the society at this time. I'm not sure we can make the same inference to Paul's community. I don't think that we're talking about a group of people in the community who are being pulled into Paul's orbit and his leadership, his legacy, who are prisoners, who are disabled, who are, again, orphans or widows or beggars. He's not really dealing with that part of society. And that's a strong claim, but I think we need to stand by it based on all the research we have about middle-class urban Christians. Jean-Francois, please tell me if you want to embellish more on any one of these parts.
No, I think we can keep moving.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Where are the slaves in this ladder?
That's a good point, right? Because we know that some Jewish slaves, possibly 6,000, were brought for one project at one point in history. Do we have freedmen here? Do we have slaves? What do we know about Paul's Corinth and slaves? I didn't pick up a whole lot.
Let me also say that something about slavery and antiquity, we're talking about a very large segment of the population who would be occupied in all sorts, would have all sorts of occupations.
Okay.
Slavery, you would have farm workers would be slaves, but also sometimes you would have estate management who would be slaves. And you became slave mostly because of wars. You would be on the side that is defeated and you end up in slavery, or sometimes you would become a slave because you do a personal bankruptcy.
Okay.
Right.
And sometimes slavery is for a lifetime, and sometimes it's just for a few years. But indeed, you would have all sorts of conditions for slaves. Farm workers and slaves working in mines would be in miserable conditions, while slaves also managing estate, teaching children.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that has not changed that much, eh? At the what I would call the equivalent of the elementary school level, much of the teaching was done by slaves.
There's incredible accounts, and I remember when I was teaching high school in Harlem in New York City in the 1990s, we had a course on great civilizations, and one of our units was on the Romans, and we looked at the differences between American slavery, for example, North American US slavery, and slavery in the ancient times, particularly as reported by, for example, Greek historians themselves, who might have been close to being enslaved, because again, when you were conquered, then that status was conferred to you, and you could work your way out of it, but it was sort of a default position. And when my students learned that there were doctors who were slaves, this was a shock, right? There are orders, or there are people who are teaching reading and writing, rhetoricians. It expands our notion of slavery. So even when we talk about mine workers, those who worked in silver or mines or lead, tin mines, that's one conception of slavery: manual, hard, grinding labor without any compensation in terms of the wage market. Then we think about these other sort of professions in which people had literacy and skills, and they themselves had been enslaved at some point. I was wondering about this, Jean-Francois Racine. Freedmen, this is an interesting category. Do we think that there probably were some freedmen in these early congregations?
Yes, likely. And as I mentioned in the previous talk, where does Paul get his Roman name, Paul?
That's right. That's right, manumitted.
Not unlikely from the former master if the family was enslaved at some point and ended up working for a Roman master.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your previous talk, Jean-François, and I was surprised because I thought that the hypothesis was that the name like Paul was a bit like the Chinese who have an English first name just because they have to move around and they don't give themselves their Chinese name. So whenever you do business in China, people have their Chinese name for their Chinese friend, but they also have their English name that bears no relation to their Chinese name, which is the one we foreigners know them under.
Yes. Yeah, that would be a possibility, but slavery again was so pervasive in the society. And typically when someone was freed, they would keep the name of their former owner. And that has continued in the United States. You know, when you see African Americans who have Irish names, you know that didn't come from Ireland. That was a name that they adopted, you know, the name of the former master.
Yeah,
You don't buy the story that he was from that he had Roman citizenship. Do you think it's an invention of Luke?
No, because again, I don't buy it on the one hand, because the Romans didn't grant citizenships like this. And on the other hand, Paul mentions that he was beaten in 2 Corinthians, that he was beaten in public a few times. If you were a Roman citizen, no, you don't get beaten in a public place. You would, you know, you could claim immediately your status, and no one would dare doing this. The question about also Roman citizens is, you know, a question that surfaces sometimes. How do you show it? Mostly because sometimes if you travel, you carry your birth certificate, or in most times, you're Roman citizen because you're dealing with people from that social class. And they can tell immediately that you belong to that class. And you can tell that you're a friend of this one and this one.
So, you know, it's an interesting portrait again, and I'm glad that it was brought up when Garneau said that, you know, we're looking at this sort of vision of what the early Christian movements look like through a set of documents, right? The Gospels, the Acts, the letters. And then we have obviously Josephus and some other sources. But one thing we want to pull out of today's talk, and this goes back to our theme of connecting sort of the middle to trade, to the idea that early Christians were, as we said, kind of not necessarily falling through the cracks, but had their own place, which was not to be inside of either the landed aristocracy and the equestrian orders of Corinth, nor to think about the unskilled labor and the beggar and the person who's completely below subsistence level. So if there's a gospel in the early Christian community about serving the poor, and if there's a wisdom tradition, even among Jews, in terms of giving alms and support to the poor, and this is mentioned by Paul, this isn't the group of people that he's pulling from. You have to have enough subsistence to be able to give it to somebody else, which goes back to the collection. He certainly thinks, and we can infer that he thinks, that they have sufficient means to gather a collection. And you wouldn't ask that of day laborers and beggars and poor. So there is evidence in the text about social conditions. It's somewhat thin. He's not doing a sociology of this era. He's not a sociologist or historian, but there's some evidence. And this quote gives us a feeling, again, that you can put aside whatever you have extra that you've earned, and that those collections can be gathered, accumulated, and then packaged up and taken to Jerusalem. And that's an interesting story in itself, which we won't talk about right now. But again, this is a middle, I hate to say middle class, that's not quite right, but it is a community that has enough means to be able to give something to others in a larger network. All right, off to you.
Let me add to this one also. on the previous slide, when he says that every week you should put aside something, it means also that they have to accumulate it slowly. Paul cannot come and say, write me a big check, because they won't have that amount of money. So it has to be worked out progressively. And it gives a very good sense of where they are. They can put some money aside, but they don't have this huge bank account from which they can draw a huge sum when asked for.
And it seemed to have been a very important question.
Yes.
Collection.
Yeah, that among all the topics, when people sometimes summarize Paul with justification by faith, this is a marginal topic that you find only in 2 letters. At the difference, the collection on behalf of the Church of Jerusalem surfaces in 4 different letters. And in one letter, it's, let's say, something close to 15% of the whole letter. That says how important is this project. And if you've been in fundraising, capital campaigns and everything, you realize, yes, getting money is, much of sometimes what we're trying to do.
So the roots of the Catholic Church are going up to the first days.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to think about it. I would agree with that. I think actually what you see in this early community is like all associations and communities, we need to have enough revenue to be able to generate some kind of legitimacy and some kind of connection to a larger organization. So we're going to get to that, right?
Yeah, and the other thing also, we often have the false impression of all these organizations don't need money.
Right.
Yeah.
And in our daily life, we know very well that whatever we do in terms of organization, we always need money.
Yeah.
This, even if there are ideals, very soon we come down to this question: we need money, and how are we going to get it? And this is no different.
Yeah, and the question of the collection has been read by different theologians, non-theologians, as I've read it, as a very interesting problem as well for Paul and his leadership. It's not just that he's benignly thinking about how do I get money to give it to the poor in Judea, or that I'm going to go to James and say, here's some money, Peter, here's some money. Would you just take this gratis from us, this gratitude? There's also a complicated question of his establishing that he can do these things as a leader.
Yeah.
That when he says, my mission is to serve the Greek and yours is to serve the Jew, I'm going to be a person who can prove to you that I can not only do that, but I can get these folks to pony up, we say, to give something to say they are connected to this church in Jerusalem. So again, it's Paul showing that he can raise money, he can deliver on a promise of it, and he can show that money as a good faith gesture, a goodwill gesture. That's his leadership. Not all leaders can do that.
Sure.
It goes where in Jerusalem? Because obviously if they collect money, others must be collecting money there. It's not going to the temple. So it's not the Jewish collection for the temple. It comes in addition to that. What the hell are they doing with all this money in Jerusalem?
It would go to the Church of Jerusalem.
Meaning James and Peter's congregation.
Yes. Yeah, because Jerusalem, beside the temple, is not a very wealthy city. It's not producing any good. The main wealth of the city comes from people coming to the temple, and this community, this Christian community, may not have been very wealthy. May have also. You sometimes read that they may have been poor managers of whatever they had, and they found themselves into financial hardship.
And I think, by the way, Garneau, this is exact. I'm substituting out for your last name. I feel bad about it, but we know each other. You can call me Duckor. No, I'm thinking the same thing. This is not going to the high priest. This is not being filtered into the existing Jewish temple. This is going to the equivalent of emerging Jewish communities that are Christ believing, that have accepted Christ as a Messiah. And so James, I've always thought about as being somebody who was closest to the idea of a more Judean perspective. And Paul, again, has made this claim: I can go out into the world, perhaps from a Pharisaic outlook, perhaps from the instinct of revelation and mystery of Christ, that he sees something special, but I can take money from one place and bring it to you. Again, I think we don't have to, these are his bona fides. This shows that Paul's a serious person. And it's a fascinating, I think, piece of the puzzle of his leadership. Moving along, section 5, huh? Should we talk about that?
Sure. Go ahead.
Actually, this is you, I believe, no?
Yes, yeah, I'm doing that one. One thing I should say right from the start is when we're talking about churches at that time, we for us from the 21st century, we think about church mostly as a building. And people eventually that go into the building. But let me add that before the 3rd century, there was no dedicated building for church that would be called churches. And when I speak about the church, I'm mostly talking about a group of people that come together. And they would come together in private houses. It's only in the 3rd century that you start seeing groups that are so big that a private house cannot accommodate them, and you need to build brick and mortar building to serve only for church gatherings. And you see also that during the 2nd century, there's an evolution as groups, churches become bigger. What you see in archaeological a house would be expanded with a new story or with an annex built to accommodate larger gatherings. So when I say that this is a church, it meets in a private house. The question is, how many people can you fit comfortably in a house? Not likely 300 people. So, but church houses at that time, especially larger ones, could accommodate easily 50 to 60 people. Of course, they are not laying down on couches. They would be tightly together. But, when we're talking about these house churches, in most cases, we're talking about a group of people in the 2 digits. If whenever they come together for a weekly or monthly meal, they would form the Church of Corinth. And we could talk about, people in the upper 2 digits or perhaps 3 digits. The church, they call themselves eventually the church. The Greek word is ekklesia. It's the assembly. And this is a term that didn't invent. The term existed for all sorts of associations who called themselves churches, that is assembly.
Jean-François, am I right in imagining something akin to the Hasids meeting in Outremont?
Yeah, perhaps. I'm not familiar with them though.
No, but the Orthodox Jews and their meeting in a family house, and they seem to move around.
Well, yeah. I would add to that the Quaker. In fact, there are many versions of Protestant sects that absolutely follow this model of a house, a small gathering, nothing very fancy. So yeah, we could look at the Hasids. We could also look at the Quakers, which is interesting. These smaller groups. And I was just thinking Assembly of God. Somebody calls themselves the Assembly of God.
Yeah, it's one of
again, interesting. The assembly word has been lost for many people in modern Christianity. We say church today, right? That's how we think.
Yes. Yeah, there's a denomination, Protestant denomination that
Well,
calls itself the
I
Assembly of
didn't know
God.
that the word ecclesia could be used to mean any sort of assembly. I thought that it was I thought that it was the name given to the people assembled together in on the Pnyx, the colon in Athens, where there was the meeting place of the whole people, and that people was divided between a laos, which was the lay people, which was and then the kleros, which were elected, the chosen by
Yeah.
and I thought that laos meant the people as opposed to its rulers, and ecclesia mean the whole people, kleros and laos included.
Yeah, that's what would be the case in Athens, in classical Athens, in the first century. And we're going there. It would be one of the various names associations could call themselves.
Okay, but ecclesia is a more common word. It can be used for any sort of assembly, like the word assembly in French or English.
Yes. What I would say is that whenever you look at the terminology that came into existence among Christians, they didn't coin, they didn't invent new terms. They took the terms, the terminology that was common around them to explain, what kind of group they were. And also even with the officers, the officials of this organization, they didn't coin, they didn't invent new terms. They took terms that were very common in the organizational structures. So
was it a way to protect themselves?
No, it would be simply that you don't need to invent a new term if there are perfectly good terms available around you.
All right. You're not a petition.
Yes. So Wayne Meeks, again, I bring him back because he's been so influential in the field since 1980s. Try to understand what in that society, what kind of group would be a church, what kind of model would serve to organize that group. And he first looked at household. How much can we look at these early churches as a household? That is a family house, extended family house. Yes, that provided a good model. As you know, also households were governed by the paterfamilias, the man in charge of the family. And the paterfamilias, the householder, runs the place and decides also who comes in the house and who cannot come in the house. This is an interesting model for a small group, but it becomes problematic as a model once the group increases in size. Another model that Meeks investigated is how much would the early Christian church in Corinth look like the synagogue. That is typically the group of Jews in a city. And he would say, well, that may be a valid model of organization, but actually we have no idea how synagogues were organized in Corinth at that time. And there was not a single way to organize synagogues in the Jewish diaspora. They could be very different depending on the city. So synagogue may be a valid model, but since we know nothing about synagogues in Corinth, better not to go there. Meeks also suggested to look at philosophical and rhetorical schools to understand how these early churches were organized. And that's an interesting comparison. And let's say in the 2nd century, when Justin, an early church writer, wants to explain to his interlocutor what is the church, he would use the term, it's like a philosophical school. Yes, this is in the 2nd century, 100 years later. But at that time, philosophical schools, there were some big ones, but in Corinth, that was not typically very important. plus several of these schools were organized around the teacher, and the teacher would be an itinerant teacher, would go from one place to another to teach. So the schools had sometimes a very short lifetime. The teacher would be in Corinth for a year and would move to the next place the year after. So the most promising model to understand the organization of these early churches has been voluntary association. If we can move to the next slide, I'll just add that we all know about voluntary associations because our world, our societies have many of these associations, and I just put the logos of some of them. So associations nowadays and at that time could be could be sometimes professional associations. The associations of the tent makers or the metalsmith, the blacksmith of Corinth. These could be also cultic associations around a god, some deity. You would have also associations related to ethnic associations, assuming that people moved from one place to another. When they would come in a new city, they could establish an ethnic associations, the associations, let's say, of people from Cilicia in Corinth. And you would also have in bigger cities neighborhood associations and even entertainment associations. People who practice, let's say, flutists, acrobats, gladiators would sometimes form an association. And when I list all of them, you get the impressions that these are separate categories, but they could be also overlapping. Let's say you would find in Corinth an association around the worshippers of the Egyptian deity Isis, where most people members of that association would be Egyptians. And that would be an ethnic association, but also a cultic one.
Jean-Francois, I just wanted to point out that in English today, we use, and I'm sure there's connections with French, society, association, group, coalition, club. Yes. We have so much variation in the way we describe, right? And so this is such a fascinating area of how do you describe an early form. And as you said, we're borrowing just literally from what Corinthian associations would have looked like. So this makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Some of these associations, clubs, would call themselves a church. Some of them would even call themselves a synagogue. Not that they were Jews, but synagogues mean to get together. Mm-hmm. That's the meaning of the term in Greek. In English, in Latin, they would be called the collegium, a college. Right. In Greek, they would use the term theasoi. And when you start looking at all these associations, they use all these terminology. They also had the structure of governance, the equivalent of a board of directors, of a board of trustees, where people would rotate in the various positions. Usually the president of the board of directors, or the people who would be in the executive group in that association would be called the bishops, les évêques. Those who would serve on the board would be often called the deacons, that is the diacres. So these are all terms that have passed into church terminology in the following centuries.
I think an interesting comparison for those interested in business and entrepreneurship and the sociology of business organizations must be the way in which you go from someone's garage with 1 or 2 people working on a project to 7 people, 12 people, depending on how much venture capital funding you get, and also probably depending on how much your social network is willing to contribute what we call sweat equity, you've got this sort of emerging sense of trying to define the form and going from more loose sorts of relationships to more structured. And what we see early here is as people are borrowing what they already know, these associations are not completely flat. They're not totally flat. There is somebody, as you said, Jean-Francois, who can actually sort of be the president of the equivalent of the board of directors and rotate. And that begins to show that there's a sense that these organizations do need to have a stable leadership, and they do need to have people that can pass on those roles from year to year. And I think part of Paul's leadership challenge is that as things are growing and changing, and people are noticing that, it becomes a question of how do you impose a certain degree of consensus on what we stand for. So it's an interesting problem. And I think you see this again in the business world. I remember studying venture capital cases where, it starts off with a small team. They seem to work okay together. They add in some management. They bring in somebody who knows more about finance. The next thing you know, this organization is really struggling to figure out what its core mission is based on the core founder's vision. And so, Claude, please, just kicking some ideas around there.
Yeah, I just want to tell you that for me, what you described to us is the development of a new organization.
Yes.
That will become an international organization.
Yes, and
Yeah.
let's the reason also why this model is so interesting is that you have to ask yourself, how would these people perceive themselves in that society, and how would they be perceived? They could perceive themselves as one of these various associations in the city, and they could be perceived as well as one association among the others. And there's been so much written about voluntary associations at that time. And I just give you an example. This is a book by Philip Harland, who teaches at York University in Toronto. This is probably one of the most recent and comprehensive studies about associations, synagogues, and congregations in the Mediterranean at that time. There's also these associations sometimes would get people mostly from the same social class. People tended to come together who belong to the same social class, but there could be, in an ethnic association, there could be people from various substrata of the society. Some associations would be mostly for men, other for women, but some others would allow a certain blend of males and females. The nice thing about associations is that we see from documents inscriptions, sometimes inscriptions that give the roster of who's a member, and you start looking at the names. And for some associations, you see male and female. You see people from various ethnic origins. You get a sense of, yes, there would be a blend of people in some groups, and some other groups would be ethnically driven or socially, would appeal to people from a certain social class.
So we see patterns of pluralism in these early communities, which would again make sense in terms of how the Christ following groups. Let's pivot now to a really interesting question, because we've been talking sort of abstractly about organizational forms and association, but we're back to Judaism, which is again what we know is driving a lot of where Paul is coming from in terms of his own understandings.
And the question would be for the members of these house churches in Corinth, how would they come together to be in, to become Christ followers of Christ? The most common assumption would be that they would have come to this through a certain interest in Judaism. Again, there would be, we should assume that there were Jews in Corinth because they were all around the Mediterranean. There would be Jewish groups in Corinth. For people at that time, Judaism is, again, an official legal religion. So you're not an outlaw if you're a Jew. One important source also to know about Judaism in the first century is Flavius Josephus, a contemporary, roughly a contemporary of Paul. He was also a Pharisee, and he wrote extensively about Judaism of his time, and a book, a very long work called The Jewish Antiquities, which was basically an explanation about the origins of Judaism and explains the main traditions of Judaism. And it was promoting also Judaism as an ancient tradition because it was perceived at that time as one of these ancient traditions that was worth a look for anyone who was interested in new currents and new ideas and would be interested in tapping in an ancient source, an ancient religious tradition. For many people at that time, the question was eventually, once they got interested into Judaism, is whether they should become Jews or not to become Jews. The problem for many is that the Torah is, being a Torah abiding Jew could be a heavy lift because they would, if they were males, they would need to undergo surgery and change something in their diet. So that was sometimes the obstacle. They were interested in the whole thing, except that they wouldn't go to that final step to become Jews, but they would become knowledgeable about the Jewish religious traditions. So, and that's why when Paul comes with his idea of the possibility of becoming part of this tradition without undergoing surgery and without changing your diet, that becomes appealing. If you want to know more about the situation in the first century, how Judaism would be perceived around, there's this very good book by Pamela Eisenbaum, who teaches at ILIF School of Theology in Denver. She's a Jewish New Testament professor of New Testament studies. And the title captures the main argument. Paul was not a Christian. And Paul was indeed a Jew, never left Judaism, but the book also indicates how Judaism was appealing to people at that time. Now, for every Jew at that time, the perception of Israel is, if you want to be part of Israel, you simply have to abide by Torah. Once you follow Torah, you're in. If you stop following Torah and you decide that Torah doesn't make any sense and you're not going to follow it, you're out. So Jews are those who follow Torah. Gentiles are those who don't follow it. Now Paul comes with this idea that you don't need to follow Torah to be part of Israel. How does he go there? Paul actually had this kind of mystical experience of Christ. He never tells the whole experience anywhere. And there are some hints about this mystical experience. And one of these hints, one of the best ones, is found in the letter to the Galatians in chapter 2, when he says that it's no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So he had this at some moment. We don't know whether it was a progressive experience, a progressive discernment, or sudden mystical experience, but he had this, he came to realize that Christ was in some way a corporal personality, which could live into people, and people lived in Christ, which brings us to his next move, where he suggests that the boundary marker to be part of Israel is not only Torah, it can be Christ. Now he has to explain this eventually to people. And interestingly, his explanation has nothing to do with the mystical experience. He explains it as a good Jew by going to the scripture and making a fancy grammatical argument. He starts with God's promise to Abraham, which in Genesis 12, which is basically to give Abraham a descendants, an offspring, and to stand by him. That's what God promises to Abraham. Next, Paul will say that, well, notice that Abraham descendants, offspring, is singular, not plural. And therefore, he understands that Christ is the real descendant of Abraham because he had the same attitude as Abraham. And so the believers become part of Christ. Christ is the descendant of Abraham. Christ is a corporal personality. Therefore, by being part of Christ, they become part of Israel. I don't know how convincing this argument would be to Judaizer who oppose Paul's explanation, but it actually was fair game to argue from the perspective of grammar on singular and plural to make your point. Notice again that the argument has nothing to do with his mystical experience, because there's a limit also to which you can appeal to mystical experience to explain your positions. We're always suspicious of people who would explain their behavior by saying simply, God told me this.
Yeah, I think that's
we need a better argument.
I think that's a really important point, and I think that goes back to reading Paul as a gifted leader who was able to actually discern what types of claims, arguments, ideas need to be shared with whom and when. Yes. So that there's not one single type of Greek who's trying to understand Christ. There are many Greeks with many points of view and many different arguments, including in some cases, those who are open to the ideas of a Peter or to an Apollos, or simply even to someone else in their community who may say, that's not what I heard. But Paul navigates those differences with rhetorical argument, without using appeals to, in this case, necessarily always spiritual experiences. But I think he also does something more. I noticed this now after we were putting together this presentation. Jean-Francois, I remember that Paul also makes a very sophisticated argument about circumcision and the fact that Abraham was not circumcised.
Sure.
That in fact, the point is that circumcision is in some sense an add-on that needs to be put in place once Abraham demonstrates some things to God. And Paul's deep question is, we weren't always circumcised, and yet we can still be in faith or in relation to God, Yahweh. And so in some sense, he sort of undoes that notion of circumcision as the marker for piety. Yes. And I think that's fascinating. So Paul is such a sophisticated thinker, but he's more importantly a leader who can communicate to different people in different ways.
Yes, and indeed, once we enter on that terrain, the theological terrain, we could be talking for the rest of the day about all the angles, all the types of arguments that he makes to address this. But I think what I'm saying is that as a leader, we also have to factor in that we're dealing with someone who had a mystical experience. And that's very different from much leadership, situations nowadays. I don't think that many leaders will appeal to their mystical experience
Not even Jeff Bezos? You don't think that Jeff Bezos will say that he's selling his stock because he's had a mystical experience?
I've never heard this, but I'd say that one, we've probably all heard about Albert Schweitzer, who was a physician, who was also a musicologist, but was mostly at the beginning of his career also a theologian. And he wrote two very important books in Christian theology. One was about the quest of the historical Jesus, and his second book was about Paul as a mystic. And I think at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, Schweitzer captured an essential aspect of Paul, that he was not, this kind of systematic theologian. Yeah, he was in a certain way, but it all started with a mystical experience that was so powerful that it impacted the rest of his career.
So before going in that rabbit hole, because I want to read Paul more as a rationalist, but
Yes.
that's a whole nother debate. Torah light is the critical point here, that no one has to, under Paul's new way, Paul's new leadership model of joining Israel, no one has to live under the burden of circumcision, dietary restriction, or even a kind of pious commitment to every single possible Jewish holiday. Rather, and this is the critical point we brought in last time, living under Torah light, as we called it, means still committing yourself actively to ethical duties. And this is what we'll try to emphasize a bit in the next time as well, that there is a rule book. It may be a different book than people understood as non-Jews and what they understood Torah to be or didn't understand, but Paul sets another frame for them to still focus on what matters.
I'd like to bring you, just before you move ahead, to something you said on the previous slide, which I hadn't realized, is the point that offspring, when Paul talked of Abraham's offspring, is a singular, and that he and Christ is the offspring. It suddenly struck me that Jews at the time might have said that Israel is the offspring of Abraham, and now Paul is saying that Christ is the offspring of Abraham, and Israel is just as much of refers to one person just as much as Christ refers to one person. He's
Yes.
Jacob versus Jesus, and the function is different. One is one who fought with God, which is Israel, and the other is one anointed by God, which is Christ. Has anything been teased out of this? Because I never thought of that, because I never thought that the offspring in question was singular.
Yeah, and we don't know how the audience, especially audience who was opposed to Paul, would react to his case. But what I find interesting is that he argues from the perspective of grammar, and it's understood as fair game. That is, you can do this. Nowadays, if you argued from the perspective of grammar, you would be told, this is not fair game. This is not how things work. You want another type of argument. But what you understand is, yeah, the argument could be taken into consideration and be maybe persuasive to some people.
We did talk last time also about the idea that collective salvation for Israel through its election by God and covenant is a more sort of structural feature of Judaism. And we noted that there's a strong tendency in certain parts of the Christian community, even today, obviously, and certain sectarian tensions about how much we personalize the relationship with God because we have, quote unquote, been saved by our relationship to Jesus and Jesus's grace. That I don't think is what Paul is saying. So I want to be careful there too. I don't think that we should imply that Paul didn't understand a form of collective salvation for those who, in the time that remains, are capable of making the connection, the link, whether we say through grace or whether we say through some sort of form of engagement and covenant. Again, I don't know what the markers are for Paul yet, but we want to emphasize that rather than go into all the different sort of theologies of collective versus personal salvation or seeing Christ versus the election of the Jews, I want to come back to the ethical duties, because I actually think this is where Paul remains a Jew, and we should not try to whitewash Paul away from his strong sexual ethics. He is clearly opposed to porneia. He's also very opposed to pagan idols and worries a lot in the first letter about that. He does mention things about community meals, which I find less interesting personally, although that must have been very important to them. But we struggle with how to deal with some of these, what we would call boundary markers, because while you might not have to get circumcised to join, you certainly would have to be aware that you're going to be held accountable for a certain kind of idolatry or a certain kind of engagement with porneia. And so again, how do we deal with that in a way that doesn't overemphasize Paul and make him into a Puritan, but also underemphasize it and act as if he sort of is a relativist who just wants people to accept Christ. And once they've accepted Christ, it's all good and we don't have to worry anymore. I think that's exactly what he's anxious about, is that some people are claiming Christ or in Christ, but they're not actually carrying through with the ethics. Jean-Francois, do you want to comment on that or push back on my
No, I think
impression?
we can move on.
Okay.
And what also we should be careful about is that Paul will tell his followers that, you know, they don't need to undergo circumcision and to follow dietary laws to be in. But what Christians sometimes have understood is that Paul is telling everyone that Torah has become unimportant. You know, you can do away with the whole thing. We should be careful here not to overreach. Paul never says that ethnic Jews, should stop following Torah. Paul is interested again in allowing non-Jews to become associated with Israel. He's not telling ethnic Jews what they should or shouldn't do. This is not his objectives. And by extension, now what has happened in the centuries that followed, people read that Paul would be saying that finally Torah is absolutely pointless, which he never says.
Yeah.
And Claude, when you ask whether Donald Trump is driven by a mystical experience, I wonder what drives Donald Trump except his own ego. But this could go on for years. After 4 years of Donald Trump, I think we'll need another 4 years to recover.
Some congregation think that he is a new revelation.
Yes. Well,
yeah.
his followers have sometimes get into a messianic type discourse.
I think so.
So section 6 brings us to a close today. We're just going to close up with the idea of Paul's transversal project. If we think of it as a geometry, it's intersecting many lines. We've showed you pictures of actual circles and maybe Venn diagrams as the next step. The point is that there's a kind of set of intersectionalities, and critical piece of all of that. In other words, you know, whether we argue Paul was a Jew or Paul was a not yet Christian or Paul was a misunderstood Christian who was stuck in a Jewish body, there are all sorts of bizarre ways to talk about Paul. But really the critical thing for Paul, rather than for us, is what time is it for Paul? What does it mean to think, not necessarily apocalyptically, but to think in a messianic frame? So the project of Paul, simplified greatly in sort of just a set of quick steps, is, first of all, there's a quick turnaround time from the time of Christ crucified. So Paul clearly, whether through mystical experience and including a sense of rational discernment, realizes that Christ has come, Messiah has come, and he has now something to do. And so he gets busy with assembling congregations, bringing Gentiles or non-Jews into the covenant, which is the new covenant in this point with Israel. In a sense, he does admonish them quite obviously, and sometimes to the surprise of the modern reader who finds Paul harsh. He tells them stop dissembling and get focused, get on the bus, so to speak, get ready to go. He's making preparations and wants them to make preparations for what we might call upright living, which goes back to Torah light. And he wants them to keep their own particular promises to Christ, not necessarily in the form of duty, but in the form of certain core principles, core values. And again, in the time that remains, because he does see Christ's return. And we forget that. We live in a world in which Christ has now been theologized for over 2 millennia. We live in a world in which Christ has been delayed, but that wasn't the case for Paul. So Paul doesn't approach Corinthians or Galatians or Romans with the idea that, well, you have a couple more centuries to figure this out and you'll meet a few Neoplatonists and you'll have a chance to work with Augustine, and it'll all come together. No, Paul is very much thinking about the time that remains.
And what is the difference? I know that you already provided part of the answer with the mystical experience and so on, but let me force you to readdress this in a different light, which is what would be the difference between Paul saying the Messiah has come and now let's get serious, and Paul saying Messianism is bull and let's get over this whole messianistic tendency and let's stick to Torah and think deeply about what Torah is about for the rest of our time? What does, you understand what I'm trying to say? It can get all the rest of the message, and what is he saying when he says the Messiah has come? Because obviously it hasn't come politically, it hasn't come and the temple will fall and the whole nation will fall. What does this role play? Because the rest of his message, because if I look at your list, that's what raised the question, is that you could get this list exactly without any messianistic belief.
I think no, we cannot get that list exactly there, because there's this question of the penultimate point, the time that remains. The time has grown short. You know, we live in a different time, so there's an aspect of urgency to get us moving.
And that's what believing in Christ is, that we've moved from a time when we could wait for a long time, and now we've moved in a period where the time is limited. The time that is limited.
Limited, but also, and we'll be talking about this, it's a different way to look at time.
Or to even experience it. I mean, when we look at it, when we gaze upon it, we still have a distance, an alienation. We still have the way in which to sort of perceive it as a possible world. For Paul, this isn't a possible world. In my mind, Messiah come for Paul means his entire being has been overtaken by this mystical experience, and it drives him every day to the work. So, I mean, I guess I would sidestep that question in a way and say, really, it seems to me that Paul is inhabited by Christ, that allows him to work vigorously, but he also sees an eschatological horizon, meaning he has an expectation. He would not have probably lived his life thinking that he would be sitting with us today talking about him. You know, I think that's the challenge, is how to get our heads into his head without overplaying that card, which is that he's some kind of a guy who's putting up, you know, in 72 AD or whatever calendar he's using, that's when the return's going to occur. He's not saying that, but he's living it as if or as not, that one has to get to a place of inhabiting the work because it's in you. It's no longer distance, watching. Does that help at all to think about it in terms of the difference between watching something and being in something where it's driving you?
I'm thinking
Yeah.
more in terms of yes, there's something there. I'm just thinking the of the complication we get into by emphasizing too much Paul Judaism, which is what is the things about the messianism and what does it change? You're sort of hinting to that, but I'll let you continue. I think if you're going to talk about the change in conception of time, I think I'm going to get some elements of response there, of answer there.
Yes. And, just also to look at the kind of position these the Christ followers in Corinth end up. So how will the Jews look at them? They will say, okay, these Gentiles, these non-Jews have turned away from their gods. They now worship the God of Israel, but they are still non-Jews and not really part of Israel because they don't follow the whole Torah. Paul has a very different outlook on things. Gentiles have turned away from their gods. They worship the God of Israel, and now they have become part of Israel by following Christ. For the people who in Corinth, for the familiar non-Jews, they look at them, these Christ followers, they say, well, they have turned away from our gods. They worship the God of Israel. Now they have cut away ties with their ancestral religious practices. So they are becoming more or less antisocial. And when I say ancestral religious practices, I don't mean necessarily all the main gods in the Greek city. I'm talking sometimes about family gods, domestic cults, which keep you in connection with your ancestors.
You made a really important point about this that really deepened my thinking, which is that you said, Jean-Francois, that we actually have this idea that in a household, there would be worship that was done on behalf of slaves and children by the family lead. Yes. And that would be a kind of way to show not just piety, but also a sense of security and control over the house. Yes. And when you ask people to turn away from that, it was much like the experience of someone who's been asked in their modern formation, let's say, again, not to cast aspersions, but to say, if you're forming as a Jesuit, you might be asked to rethink your ancestral ties that your family has in a part of the world, if you're from Asia, for example.
Yeah, we often have this issue at our school where we train Jesuit priests. We have Jesuits from Asia, and some of them would tell us that on their deathbed, their parents make them swear to keep worshiping the ancestors once the parents are gone, which means sometimes burning incense every day at in a small altar in the house. Now, these Jesuits are very conflicted because they have become obviously Christians, and their understanding is that no, they should only worship the Christian God, but there's something bringing them back to their cultures, and they have to remain faithful to their family and their cultures. So they end up in this very difficult dilemma. And this is exactly what these people in Corinth, the kind of dilemma they would be put in. They cannot easily cut off all the ties with the religion that surrounds them because it makes them really antisocial.
And I was going to add, I think you've hit a major point, Jean-Francois, about the God. We tend too much to think that the antisocial aspect of the Christian or religion was with the God of the pantheon of Jupiter and so on. And I put the if you want to read, first of all, because it is a masterpiece of institutional history, the Fustel de Coulanges book on the ancient city, and it addresses exactly this point that the Roman religion was mostly a religion of the ancestors and not the religion that there was a political religion that was about the people on Olympus and and so on. But the main religion was that, and he goes into all what the reason why the authority of the paterfamilias was sacred, and he was a dominus, was that he was the high priest of the family religion, and that if you were to marry, the reason why there were elaborate ceremony for marriage is because you had to betray the religion of your ancestor if you were marrying and getting into the religion of the ancestors of another family, and the tradition of the husband taking the bride to make her cross the threshold of the house. Fustel de Coulanges shows that it is so that the person, the wife, can say, "I was taken by force. I didn't betray my gods. I was so the wife literally had to be taken on the day of marriage from the house of her father, never touch ground until she's in the house of the other person, so that the gods of her former religion could not pursue her in her betrayal and before her integration to the gods of the other family that she was joining. It's a fascinating book.
Yeah, and I read it, I think 20, 30 years ago or something like this. But what you understand is that this religion, ancestral religion, is part of your DNA.
Mhm.
And therefore you cannot get rid of your DNA like this.
Well, and here we go back to, though, again, who are early Christians, right? In this story we're telling, it's not that these are landed aristocrats or well-established families that are rooted deeply. They may have been in some parts of the community, but we also talked about traders and movement of peoples, and we're not quite sure if these people are uprooted a little bit more. The point stands, though, doesn't it, that the anxiety that comes, the difficult posture for Paul, is not only how to persuade through rhetoric or argument or discussion about why one ought to turn from those false idols and why going benignly into the public space and acting as if it doesn't matter is a problem. He also has to counsel and console them. And this is the thing I think about letters that we don't see. So letters don't tell us about conversations that Paul might have had with different members of the community. He talks about at one point he was in much fear and trembling. And I know there's a certain official interpretation of those statements, but I tend to look at those as a sign that Paul as a leader did have compassion, even though he was Jewish. That doesn't mean he didn't understand the anxieties of a person like Chloe or others who might have said, I'm having to give up the threshold, as you put it, Gernot. I'm having to give up something that was important to me. I suspect that Paul had the skills, part of why he would be loved and people would be loyal to him, to have compassion for that. But we have no evidence of it because we've got essentially a rhetorical letter. So I think there's things we see and we don't see in Paul, and that's also important for me as someone who reads Paul now. The absence matters as much as the presence. But as we go back to the point today, we said, so what did you say about Christ is supposed to return? Jean-Francois, can you please say some more about that? Because that's an important issue.
And Claude is, in the chat is very
in the chat, okay.
This is a very difficult posture in that society because they are not considered to be either Jews by the Jews or non-pagans by the other people around them. So they are in between. And in that case, you really expect Christ to return soon to be out of that difficult posture. And it's very clear when you read Paul's letters, a letter such as 1 Corinthians, that Paul doesn't envision this posture to last more than for one generation. So it's a very temporary movement, which in terms of leadership poses all sorts of questions, because if you're leader of an organization, you want to build for the years to come. You're thinking in terms of long term for your organization. And here it's a leadership for a short time. And that creates a very different dynamic. And that's why we come also with, this phrase, leading in provisional time and in the time that remains. And we borrow that phrase from the book by the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, In Italian, the book is Il Tempo Che Resta, was published, translated and published by Stanford University Press. The Time That Remains, in French, Le Temps qui Reste. It's a commentary about the first 7 verses of the letter to the Romans, but it's done by a philosopher, and he digs into all sorts of questions. And one of them, the main question about what kind of time are we talking about with the time, the time for these people who have joined the Christ movement. It's really a time between Christ's resurrection and his return. There's no specific date, but there's something imminent coming in. And it has implications for the community's perception of time. You change your way to live if you find yourself in this in-between space. The in-between space can be expanded as much as you want, but it's still an in-between space between 2 things.
I think it's an interesting problem for, again, analogizing back and forth between early Christian associations and, let's say, modern business formations in the entrepreneurial literature. Oftentimes entrepreneurs, I don't think, present themselves as the time that remains, but on the other hand, they live every day, every minute, and every hour, probably as if they were on the precipice of something that's going to be the next level or is going to cease. When I was over at the business school taking some courses when I was a grad student at UC Berkeley at the Haas Business School, I noticed that the way in which the business school students worked in all sorts of configurations, whether it was an applied project outside of the school or inside the classroom, they were very eager with a sense of unlimited energy and time and ability to work. You walk over to another department. I don't want to, again, cast aspersions on the culture of different academic units, but you got the sense that time was different, even in the configuration. So, people who are in business tend to busy themselves with a lot. And people who are perhaps coming from a more scholastic academic, they have a different sense. Paul seems to be more in the camp of the business, let's get this going, let's keep moving, we've got to move. Whereas he's not a scholastic academic, he's not Aquinas, he's not poring over books. He's really interested in this problem of organization now. And so again, that's what makes him interesting for the purposes of this talk coming to you all. That he has something to say about the time that remains in his own sphere. And we might find analogies to.
Yeah, and Claude just gave the analogy of the Bloc Québécois, which is an excellent one, the political party that was established in Quebec to be, to be part of the Canadian government, and we're going to work to help bring the independence, to prepare people for the independence of Quebec, and that the party was established in the in the 80s or 90s.
At the beginning of the 90s.
Yeah, the 90s, but the independence never, happened. And therefore, there's this whole question about, at some point, what is this party? Why do we need this party? What is it supposed to be doing? Because 30 years later or 20 years later, because the independence has not happened. So, it was an in-between, a party in between, but the in-between has become the normal situation.
But I put another quote, Jean-François, to challenge you a bit, but also to tease out what you think on the messianism of Paul, because we could imagine that at the center of Paul's message, obviously it's not true, but I'm just making a hypothesis to force us to think through, that the central event is the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, and the living and remaining time is what Tolkien says in the Fellowship of the Ring. That is, I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. but it is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us, which is your notion of the time that remains. And obviously that's not what Paul is saying. But what I'm saying is that they all live in the shadow, or they will very soon live in the shadow of the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. And what is the difference between saying Christ is risen and the temple has been destroyed?
So let me just pull back on the history events, right? So the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, is that correct?
Yes,
Or 70 CE, right?
Yeah.
So that means, but we already said that Paul's mission and work had begun in 50 to 60. So I was tempted to exactly say, you know, what you were thinking, but I was then actually peeling back the question of Jewish revolt, the Zealots, for example, clear faction within parts of the community in Judea and Samaria at this time. This is going on with many revolts way up until the point at which the Romans come in and crush it. So the point is, Paul, I'm wondering, he's already doing this work with this messianic, or sorry, let's not call it messianic, let's call it mystical experience. He's already motivated to work, but it's before that temple destruction. There must be something going on that isn't just a reaction, but it fits perfectly with the general atmosphere, which is that things are really not working properly within the Jewish community.
Yeah, and if you want
They're
another,
under siege.
Yeah, if you want another analogy with a contemporary group, think about the Jehovah Witnesses.
Yeah.
They are Jehovah Witnesses are close to Christianity, but they are not Christians.
Let's unpack that a little bit again, just for safety's sake.
Yeah, well, it's just that their set of beliefs is very close to Christianity, but there are many core principles of Christian orthodoxy that they don't share. The resurrection of the dead, Jesus being a divine person, and the like. But the fact is that the Jehovah Witnesses were established in the mid 19th century with the idea that the end was coming soon. It's been more than 170 years. The end hasn't come, and if you know, Jehovah Witnesses are not really, sometimes are considered to be antisocial.
Right.
They don't serve in the military. They are distrustful about government. They don't take a transfusion at the hospital. They are reluctant about healthcare. So they've been in this very uncomfortable posture for 170 years. And this is an interesting parallel about how long can you stay in that kind of position. For Christians at that time, the thing are going to improve either if Christ returns soon, or if they become a critical mass in the society, and therefore where they can become, their posture becomes a normal posture, and this whole idea of Christ's return is fading away. This is exactly what has happened.
But not for Paul, So we're ahead of ourselves again. We're not for Paul, because for Paul, he doesn't imagine the Catholic Church in Rome, Holy See. He doesn't imagine the Pope. He doesn't imagine, we can multiply all through history. Paul does not see any of that. That's not his problem.
Yeah, it's a very close, it's a close horizon.
He was building an ephemeral organization.
Yes.
That became permanent.
Yeah, which will pose all sorts of interesting questions in terms of leadership.
Yeah.
How do you lead in with the idea that you're leading only for a short time?
Yeah.
You're making a big push.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, in terms of political parallels, I was just thinking about Bobby Seale's book, Seize the Time. In the late 60s, early 70s. There's a long tradition in Western radical politics, now coming from the right, traditionally coming from the left, which is about seizing the time, the revolution now. Everything must happen at this moment. There's a messianism inside of that. Michael Walzer's written about that in political theory. Others have also documented that there's interesting parallels to those alienated or marginal or intersectional communities that don't quite fit in, but see themselves as carrying a mantle of some kind of messianic promise. So again, not to go too far afield, but to also realize it's not just the organizational political parties, but there are many political associations, environmental movement of the associations, who think of themselves as carrying messianic time.
Yeah.
You know, and this is an interesting point that Paul would have been in that. Now, to also, on the other hand, say, but Paul wasn't a fanatic in my mind. That is, I think Paul did understand commerce, business, trade. I think he did understand that people needed to make a living. And I think he did believe in sustainable communities. That is, he wasn't calling for, let's go jump off the bridge. He was calling for, let's live uprightly in the time that remains as sort of, you might say, you know, good citizens, people working hard.
And he needed commerce to move his message.
Exactly.
The city.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. He's not anti-property. He's not anti-capitalism. He's not anti, you know, globalism. He's not anti-neoliberalism. He's basically, in that way, I think actually it goes back to my thesis, not mine personally, but my sense that he's a practical Jew.
Sure.
But he has a vision that other Jews among him may or may not have. But again, he says, I'm not here to serve Jerusalem. There's good people doing that work. I'm working with my Gentile friends. These are the people I want to bring in.
Yeah.
And therefore, you know, that brings us to our talk next week. So here's the teaser. What will be in that talk? Does Paul lead by the book? When you look at modern contemporary popular books about leadership and you compare Paul to this, how does he fare in that regard? What happens also when he's a leader in Corinth? Because Paul is a translocal leader and there are governance structures in these associations. Ask yourself, how does that work?
Yeah.
When you bring a structure from, you know, leadership from outside into an organization that already has a structure.
Foreigner won't tell us what to do.
Yes. How Paul does he see himself in as a leader? What kind of language does he use to speak about himself as a leader? And we're going to go, and I always believe this becomes interesting when we go into test cases. So 4 passages to which we're going to look more closely. There would be several possible passages, but we came down to 4 of them where we see complex situations and how does he manage as a leader in these 4 situations.
We're going to do our best to also try to cross-reference a few things to these sorts of books that are well known in the field. You know, what makes a good leader? What are some of the principles? Here, chapter 5, envision the future. Interesting. Right there, chapter 5, envision the future. So does Paul have something to say in these test cases that we could learn from and discern from about these 4 big ideas, and how do they intersect with the modern literature for leadership theory?
You know, this is a remarkable presentation. At the theological level, you cannot believe in an incarnated God without doing the sort of work you've been doing. So I'm impressed. But as a professor of management, we tend to write up our case studies to fit the purpose of our teaching. You have been teaching us that if we take history cases that already existed and do the hard work of understanding history in details, we have richer cases than the ones we make up to teach leadership in the end. It takes a longer detour. It took you 2 full weeks to explain just the text that you will use as a basis. But it is a text that you take seriously in a way that we never take our business cases as seriously. And I'm looking at what you're going to tease out of this, but I cannot help thinking of a non-instrumentalization of the case in case studies.
Yeah, that what makes challenging these kinds of studies is also that you have to get into that culture to think with the parameters of that culture. And there's a limit to bend the culture to be really to give you this kind of outlook where it sounds like exactly where we are now. No, there's something always in this culture that resists. You're bending it to make it to your own image.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
the same thing with Paul. Paul is a Jew from the first century. In some ways, he's, we find connections with him, but there's something that resists.
Yeah, but
making him
even
to
that,
our own.
Jean-François, even that, Jean-François, is a wonderful leçon de choses. I don't know what the expression is in English for teaching management, because we are more and more aware of cultural diversity and the
Yes.
fact that nothing of our general theories can be applied to a context. And you're starting with the case of something really foreign to us, and you make it at the same time close, but it is impossible to be close to something that is past and something that is so culturally distant from how we view things.
Yes.
So you bring in the very notion of cultural diversity in the understanding and the necessity for management and leadership to take that into account. So I don't know how you're going to do it all next week, but I'm still really impressed.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at this from the perspective of Gadamer. At some point, we're trying to get into this fusion of horizons. This ancient text will remain a foreign text in many ways, but still, we bring our perspective and we can enter in conversation with it, in a productive conversation. Because we find places to connect, and the text is also changing our outlook on ourselves. And this is where conversation can take place.
Gadamer is a great marker for this. I think the word dialectic is another great marker. Another is the intersection of paradigms, right? Or what we might just think of as genres. In Wittgenstein's world, it might be language games. We're essentially saying that there's a discourse of leadership, right? And in some sense, it's an ahistorical discourse. It's also non-comparative, except in its view of cases from comparing IBM to, Apple. But it doesn't tend to think across these boundaries. At the same time, in theology, right, there may be less of an interest in the application of management concepts, although, as Jean-François has pointed out to me, there is a formation literature, and you do need to train leaders how to be, leaders of churches. But the point is that these two different worlds are playing with each other right now. And we're also being very careful, as we're saying, to resist the idea that one can totalize or control the other. So it's not like we have the answer to leadership challenges by reading Paul. But at the same time, I would say we have the ability to go deeper on thematic questions that were relevant to any association, any grouping, any nascent forming thing, anything that's on the move, anything that has a tight horizon. That is sort of interesting. And you don't have to think of it just as a company or a small business. And you don't have to think of it just as a political association either. And we're actually resisting the idea that there's a political view of this or there's a management view of this. We're just playing with the ideas to see if we can learn something about our own presumptions and assumptions.
No, you're onto something. I don't know whether now it remains to be seen if the mountain will get the mouse, or will we get something great. But that's the suspense of your third week. If the past is warrants the future, then we're in for a good ride again next week.
Yeah.
Yes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very
pleasure
much.
Talking with you.
It's been wonderful.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye.